year is 1996. Two friends are drinking together on New Year's Eve. And I don't know what entered their minds, but they decided to go out and they got a garland of flowers and brought it to a zoo where there was a tiger. And so they went to the tiger enclosure and they crossed the moat to get on the little island thing where the tiger was, and they approached the tiger, a Bengal tiger. They wanted to honor like some goddess or something by worshiping the tiger, and so they have this very beautiful garland of flowers that they brought for the tiger. And they approach, weaving in front of it. One throws the wreath of flowers around the tiger's neck. What do you think happened next? The tiger began to maul one of them until his buddy kicked the tiger in the face, and then the tiger killed his friend. I can't imagine the growing surprise in their minds as it slowly processed, this is not ending the way I thought it was going to end. I don't think neither of them swam across the moat anticipating I'm going to get mauled by a tiger here tonight. Sometimes I think that the Christian's approach to the world is kind of like the guys with the tiger. We go in with a warm smile on our face with something to offer them, and then we're surprised when somebody chews our face off. If you can open with me to John chapter 17, this is round 3 of Church versus World. We've been going through this prayer that Jesus offers for his disciples in John 17. Praying that God would protect them from the evil one, as we talked about last week, but still saying that he was sending them into the world. And just to remind you, church, 1 John 3:13. Do not be surprised. So not like the guys with the tigers, they were very surprised. Do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters, if the world hates you. It might sound odd, again, because 2 weeks ago I told you that being in the world means we go to evil people, right? And we eat with them, we extend grace to them, that it is possible to tell the truth as Jesus did and still have them hear you out. But I would also tell you that we need to remember what those same people did to Jesus. I mean, it was the same crowd that was saying, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, that were later shouting, crucify him. So here's John 17, verse 14. Jesus said, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. Why do people hate us? Now, Jesus doesn't say people are going to be mad at you if you don't show grace to them, or love, or people are going to hate you if you use the wrong outreach methods. He says the world is going to hate you because of who you are as my follower, because you will be different. And it's hard because one of the highest values in our culture today is not offending anybody. And we also desperately want people to accept us. And, and there's something to say, though, the reaction, and I get frustrated when I see people, though, just being stupid about it, as they go and, try and share their faith, or just the way some people are offensive. You think of the Westboro protesters. They're holding their signs and basically trying to be as offensive as they can possibly be to people. And it makes me angry when I see a street preacher and he's being just overly aggressive. And he's just shouting at people and, you're going to burn in hell and it's going to hurt so bad. And I look at them and I'm like, no, we aren't trolls. Now, 3 or 4 of the younger people. This is something on the internet. My generation, I'm sorry. My generation gave people the internet trolls. And these are people who they go online and they try and upset people. They do anything and everything they can just to make people mad. And sometimes Christians, in their approach to people, we're doing the same thing. Think of a street preacher, again, he goes to a Muslim festival to talk to them about Jesus. Good. But he brings a pig head on a stick. Bad. There's no reason for you. And he was like surprised when people are upset. And if you're like ministering to Muslims, that's the equivalent of like walking into downtown Thayer and burning a gigantic American flag. And then expecting people to hear you out as you share your message. So we aren't to be dumb about it. We can't just be offensive to be offensive and say outlandish things and then have people get upset with us and be like, what? But it's tempting to think that the opposite is true. Sometimes when I look at those people, I think, you are the problem. And you are the only reason why people hate us. And if you would just stop, everybody would love the church. I think if I welcome people into my house and eat with them, if I'm filled with love and peace, I will be treated the same way. In fact, this has become a foundation for some churches in the way they do things. Like the cornerstone the church is built on is do not be offensive to people outside the church. Now, I agree with that a great deal. But there's a limit. We have to give up the idea. Remember, Jesus says the world will hate you. We have to give up. It is a fantasy. A fantasy that we can go and reach the world with the gospel without offending anybody. You have to give up the fantasy that if I am a nice person and loving and good, that everybody will like and accept me. I mean, that's true in general, but it's especially true with the gospel. In fact, Jesus says not only should you expect to experience hostility from people, he says you should be concerned if you don't. Luke chapter 6. Blessed are you, this is right before the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you and insult you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man. All right, so he says when people do this, you're blessed. But then a little bit later, just a few verses after that, he says the opposite. Woe to you when everyone speaks well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets. Now, I think that's fascinating because that is the exact opposite of churches and how we view our success, right? And I'll be honest, you go to any pastor and you say, okay, which would you like? Box A or box B? People hating you and talking evil about you, or everybody loving and accepting you? And the general tendency is we want everyone to love and accept us. But Jesus references the false prophets, and he says, look, everybody loved them. False prophets, they were basically people who would, to make a few bucks, would go and tell you anything that you wanted to hear. And so, would you like to tell me that God approves of this or whatever? Yes, okay, that's good. You're fine. Don't change a thing. And they went around, they told people what they wanted to hear, so of course people loved them. Of course people accepted them because they're just reflecting to them the things that they want to hear. There are modern teachers today who literally argue that we should reject any portion of the Bible, any teaching, any idea that would step on people's toes, just because it might be unpopular. They're so worried that we won't get accepted by the world, they say, you know what, we can't do this. Jesus says, woe to you. Woe to you if you sell out like that and you go chasing acceptance to the point where you're rejecting my words. Because if you're to take the gospel and change it so that nobody will get offended, nobody gets their feelings hurt, nobody gets their toes stepped on, you end up with something that is no longer the gospel. And I say this because we live in a country where the largest church by attendance numbers is led by a false prophet who has built the church on telling people exactly what they want to hear. Now, this isn't to say, though, that the only way for a church to grow is by watering down the gospel and selling out. So we shouldn't, though, we have to avoid both extremes. We shouldn't take the mindset, we look at any figure who is well respected or any church that is large and growing and say, oh, they must be doing something wrong. It's just jealousy. But we have to be careful. The mindset. Why are people accepting us? Let's be a little bit more specific as far as what exactly is it, though, about being a follower of Jesus? What is it about the gospel that will make people hate you? Jesus, in John chapter 7, there's a festival going on in Jerusalem. And his family, who, by the way, thought he was nuts until he came back from the dead. His family, his brothers are telling him, hey, you want to be like a big shot? Go down to the festival, lots of people there, and just, step into the public scene. And he replies to them, though. He says, the world cannot hate you. And there he kind of implies that you're no different than them. He says, but it hates me because I testify that its works are evil. There's two senses to this. Jesus, and the words that he spoke, and the reason he was killed, is because he went out into the world. Yes, he ate with sinners, and he ate with Pharisees. But he also called out the Pharisees on their hypocrisy. Yes. So he was eating with them. He extended love and friendship, and yet he also stood up and proclaims the 7 woes against you Pharisees and scribes, and lists out their sins. Jesus also went and he spoke about adultery and theft to crowds of people who were doing those things. Jesus spoke to the sins of the culture around him. And they killed him for it. And then the early church comes in. And the Jews rejected them because they couldn't accept the idea of the Messiah dying in such a way. And then the church was hated for rejecting all the idols of the Roman culture around them. And then the Roman Empire falls, and the Germanic tribes were offended. The teachings of Jesus, how could he say that we must love our enemies instead of taking revenge for ourselves and maintaining our honor? The idea of turning the other cheek when slapped was very offensive to them. And then you fast forward a few more years and people are upset with the gospel for the opposite reason. It's too warlike.
Yes.
All this talk of being a soldier for Christ. No, Christians are too eager to wage war. Instead, the German tribes say, no, we must wage more war. I have a friend who rejected the gospel. I was talking to him about it one day. He said, no, I could never do that whole Christianity thing. He said, it's offensive to me. The whole idea of being forgiven by faith and not anything that I've done. That's just, I can't deal with that. His life was built on pride. And the belief that he was smart enough and talented enough and wealthy enough that he could go and do enough good things, and that's what he wanted his merit with whatever God there may be to be based on. And the idea of the cross telling him, you are completely helpless, there's nothing you can do but accept work that somebody else has done on your behalf, was offensive to him. And so I tell you, if I were to somehow try and, okay, I get that you don't like that about the gospel, let me change it so it's acceptable to you, I've ended up with something that is no longer the gospel. Jesus is offensive in some way in every language and culture on earth. Because the human heart warps every language and culture on earth. And sin is found all over the world. So Jesus said, the world hates me because I testify that its works are evil. And so how arrogant are we today? You look at the culture around us, and you look at all of that history and all the different reasons people have gotten their feelings hurt over the years, and we would tell God, because our culture now deems your word to be wrong, it is you who must change. Because we find it offensive. if you want to put it in language they would understand, you are being culturally ethnocentric in believing that your current morality is the standard by which all others are judged. Because in 200 years, I got news for you. 200 years from now, they will look back on our culture today and laugh at their moral values, just that you may smile at the thought of a Germanic tribe insisting on taking revenge by killing people who offend them. So to tell the world around us, you do understand, right, that future generations will judge you, and they will also, though, be offended by the gospel for different reasons. I guarantee it. The reasons we have may change, but this fundamental reality that there is hostility between light and darkness, it will never go away. It'll just change its face. Jesus told the world that its works were evil, but he was also hated because he was completely righteous. John 3:16, probably the most well-known Bible verse by anybody in the church. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever shall believe in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. Here's what Jesus says right after that, though. Same conversation with Nicodemus. He says, this is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people loved darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. Jesus was hated, and the problem wasn't with him. The problem was with the human heart and people who, when presented with complete righteousness, choose their own sin. Jesus would tell his followers, of course, we are the light of the world. What do you think that means for us? Now, for us, it may be our words. As we go into the world as Christians, John the Baptist called out Herod, married his brother's wife, and he said, Herod, this is not okay. Herod, you are a person with absolute authority in our land, but what you're doing is evil, and so Herod killed him. It may sometimes be our words, but sometimes it may simply be the witness of a righteous life that makes people uncomfortable around. Have you ever experienced that? You're around somebody and simply the knowledge that like you attend church. Let me tell you, as a pastor, I get this all the time. In fact, sometimes I really hate that point in the conversation when it comes up that I do, because it's been going well up to that point. And then I mention, I'm a pastor. Instantly tighten up. And I'll be honest, with some people it is just the recognition, and it's nothing to do with me, it's simply that I remind them of God. That simply saying that word reminds them that there is a God. And a lot of people have this perception of pastors as like holy men or whatever. And people who live in the darkness, the light makes them uncomfortable. So we had our first meeting with Celebrate Recovery on Thursday. Thank you for praying. It was a small group. We had a couple people sick and out, but about 6 of us gathered together, and it is a start. I want you to continue praying because there are people who were aware of the group, people who are in addiction, who chose not to come. In fact, one of the flyers that we put up, Miss Crystal told me that she found one of the flyers advertising it torn down and thrown in the garbage. And it's hard for us to understand. And she was confused. She's like, why? What would possess anyone to be mad about that? Right? Like who goes and says, no, like people's lives must be destroyed. That's a good thing. Like who gets offended at the thought of people being released from their addictions? Exactly that. That's the truth of it, is that some people, you live in the darkness, and even the thought of somebody else getting clean upsets you because it testifies of your own life. And it makes you start asking those questions. If that person can get clean, why can't I? So the response is hatred and rejection. I've lived this. When I was outside of church, I hated church people. I hated, and we made up terms for them, in high school. We called them the super, ultra, mega Christians. Because we were totally fine. If you were like, oh, you call yourself a Christian, you'll come out drinking with us, totally fine with you. Not offended at all. But it was those few students who not only would wear the cross necklace if they lived it in their life, and we could feel that difference about them where God is real. They hated it. Because I looked at them and I thought, there is a standard of life that I can't match. And I've got things in my life that I'm hiding, and just being around them makes me uncomfortable. And so this is why it's so important for us as we go into the world to be sharing the gospel. As Jesus said a few verses earlier, you live in darkness. But Jesus did not come to just destroy you for being evil. The gospel is not just simply all of your evil deeds being exposed and you continuing to dwell in the shame and brokenness that you're in right now. That God wants to drag you into the light to change you. Jesus says in John 15, again talking to his disciples, this is the rest of the verse, whoever lives by the truth comes into the light, so that it may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God. That should be us as a church. Just as we're around people and they may become uncomfortable by it. Now, I'm not saying please don't strut around. Because, Lord help us, some Christians do this too. Look at you. You're waiting on my table. I know you weren't at church this morning. Right? I tithed today. I get a little button. Right? That's not what he's talking about. Workers, our life should be in such a way, you know what it's like when your boss shows up unexpectedly? Suddenly you may want to hide. The fact that you're looking at Facebook at work. Something like that. Our life as Christians should be lived in such a consistent way that any part of our life that is brought to public witness would not be cause for shame. Jesus tells his disciples, if the world hates you, keep in mind that it hated me first. In all of this, remember, he keeps pulling his disciples back to this idea. You are following me. So you're following me, and they've been following him for 3 years now, right? And they'd watched him do this. He says, look at my pattern of life. Go into the world. Be separate from it, but love those people. And remember when they hate you. Tells them later, people think they're doing a service to God if they kill you. He says, when they hate you, keep in mind they hated me first. You're in good company. Again, if we're hated for the right reasons, not because we're jerks. If we are hated for righteousness, remember Jesus says you're blessed then. He says again, if you belong to this world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world. But I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. Remember what I told you, a servant is no greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you also. If they obeyed my teaching, they will obey yours also. Let's not be surprised Now, I'm not saying that we go into every relationship with anybody inside or out of the church, like waiting every day for them to chew our face off. That we treat people on the outside with mistrust and a guardedness. It is that sober-mindedness that we go into the world and we love people and we are prepared for when this happens. That we're following in the footsteps of Jesus. And that we're not dismayed by it. Hear me. Just don't watch the news anymore. Do yourself a favor. But when you watch it, when you hear the tidings of what's going on in the world, don't be upset as though something unusual is going on. So you see the polls and the way people identify. This is just my opinion, I think we're on the verge of this massive cultural shift in America. Now, it's going to be delayed in small town life here in the Bible Belt. But basically, for a very long time in American life, you've had this cultural identity of who we are as Americans, and that has included being Christian. And so for years and years and years, standing up and saying, I am a Christian, I am a member of a church, has meant good things for you. People regard you highly. It is socially acceptable. And everybody you talk to, or the general consensus is, you stand up and remember, hey, we're all Christians here, right? That is changing. The youngest generation, the largest proportion, since they began measuring these things, of people who say, I identify with no religion in particular. The rise of the nun. And in reality, what's been happening is this, is you have some people, again, the ones that I really hated, who live a righteous life and are passionately pursuing Christ. And then you have other people that are like, well, I don't really buy into all of this, but it's cool now, so I'm going to stand with you guys. And then you have the little fringe parts of our society that hate God. And what's happening is those people in the middle who have been saying, well, because it's convenient, I'm a Christian too, is they're just going to take a step over here. You go to a college campus right now, that's essentially what it is. And so that it's no longer the people who deny God who are on the fringes, it is the people who are followers of Jesus and live it out who will become the fringe. Ooh, you're kind of radical. So like I said, I have no idea, maybe by the time Christine's grown up that we begin to really experience that here. But I just don't want us to be surprised as we see these things, or dismayed. Jesus tells his disciples, and this has been the pattern of the church throughout history, don't freak out. It'll be okay. You're following Jesus. You experience that hate, be like, man, I'm in good company. Next week, we'll talk about the outcome of this hatred. As Jesus says, they will persecute you. And we'll talk about how we handle it when those things happen. Let's pray. God, we'll be honest with you this morning. None of us want to be hated. None of us enjoy rejection. We want our neighbors to think highly of us. We want the people we work with to respect us. And yet, God, we cannot avoid the repeated warnings that you give us in your word that when push comes to shove, there will be times when we are hated. It won't be that we're hated because we said something rude or insensitive. It won't be that we're hated because we failed to use the right techniques. That there will be times when people will hate us simply because we remind them of you. God, help us not to shrink back from that thought. To remember that as we confess your name before people, you will confess our name before the Father. To know that we stand in good company. This is nothing unusual. It is, in fact, what you've called us to. And God, let us respond with love. In Jesus' name.